Chapter in Sudan. I would also like to thank the staff of the Commission for organizing this important and timely hearing. Finally, I would like to formally welcome my colleague and new co-chairman of the Commission, Congressman Joe Pitts. Congressman Pitts has been an active member of the Commission for many years, and I look forward to working with him, and I thank him for his leadership on this and so many other human rights issues. Unfortunately, the problem of human rights violations in Sudan is not a new one. Today marks our 5th hearing on this topic since the Commission was founded in 2008. I am profoundly troubled that we continue to need to bring to light many of these same issues, but I remain deeply committed to making sure that we in Congress are doing as much as we can to protect the fundamental rights of the Sudanese people and to make sure that their basic needs are provided for. Sudan has suffered from internal conflicts for decades, as outlying regions have taken up arms against the central government they see as failing to protect them and willfully neglecting their needs. In 2003, the Sudanese government responded to rebels in the Darfur region with a counterinsurgency campaign that had had disastrous consequences for civilians. Sudanese forces and the infamous Janjaweed militia attacked and destroyed hundreds of villages, killed tens of thousands, and displaced more than 2 million people. The impact was so severe that the international community and the United States government recognized that acts of genocide had been committed against the population of Darfur. Here in the United States, in October 2006, President Bush signed into law the Darfur Peace Accountability Act, which gave the U.S. administration additional tools to sanction Sudanese officials considered to be complicit. In 2009, the International Criminal Court indicted Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and in 2010, it added genocide to the list of charges. Yet, here we are again. Darfur has continued to be plagued by violence, and in 2011, conflict reunited in the states of South Kordofan and Blue Nile. Nearly 500,000 people were displaced just in the first half of 2014. Hundreds of thousands of people have fled to neighboring countries, unable to return home because of lack of security. The UN estimates that 6.6 million people are in need of aid, but relief agencies like Doctors Without Borders or MSF face increasingly difficult operating conditions and restrictions imposed by the government. On January 20th of this year, Sudanese forces bombed a hospital in South Kordofan operated by MSF for the second time in less than a year, forcing it to suspend operations to protect its personnel. Hospitals and villages have also been targeted by airstrikes in Darfur. In December 2014, Sudan expelled 2 top UN officials from the country. New reports document the use of sexual violence as a weapon, which we will hear more about today, and Mr. al-Bashir is still in power. Everyone opposes genocide, but the question is, what are we really doing to redress the Darfur genocide and to stop a new genocide in other border regions? I look forward to learning from our distinguished panelists today about what is happening on the ground in Sudan, what we are doing to try to end human rights violations in that country, and what further actions we can take to make sure that the people of Sudan finally get the basic protections that they deserve. And with that, I want to yield to my colleague, Congressman Joe Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be named co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission along with you, and we've worked together on many issues for many years in a bipartisan manner on human rights, and I look forward to continuing to do that work. I'd also like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your efforts on this important hearing, this important issue, the 5th hearing since 2008 on this issue. It has been over a decade since the last perceived height of the Sudan conflict, specifically the genocide that was taking place in Darfur in 2004. However, many international observers are witnessing deteriorating conditions in Sudan, and the UN has stated that the conflict threatened to produce 2004 levels of violence. Observers have witnessed increasing restrictions from the government in Khartoum, as well as a renewed boldness by the government in launching military operations against its own people. And we've also seen routine violations of the arms embargo in recent years. Reports late last year indicated a campaign of mass rape of women and girls by the Sudanese army. Alarmingly, the deterioration in the last 2 years follows a report by the UN Human Rights Council in late 2013 on the situation of human rights in Sudan, in which it characterized the government as continuing to make progress in, quote, legislative and institutional developments aimed at improving the situation of human rights in the country, end quote. This leads me to believe that whatever efforts made by the government to achieve a great respect for human rights is either failing to manifest itself in the institutions most desperately in need of reform, or made such efforts in bad faith and out of a campaign of deception towards the international community. It is well known that the government in Khartoum has been seeking relief from U.S. and international sanctions. This Congress must signal and make it clear to the government that such measures will not even be considered until a cessation of military hostilities is realized and when measurable progress in respecting the fundamental human rights of its people is observed. To be clear, the human rights situation in Sudan is heading in the wrong direction. Our government should explore possibilities which further isolate and sanction the government in Khartoum if substantial progress is not made to reverse this course in the near future. I'd like to welcome and thank our panelists for their testimony today. Look forward to directing increased attention to this issue here in Congress. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I would like to introduce our first panel of witnesses from the administration. I'm pleased to welcome Ms. Catherine Weisner, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, Mr. Stephen Feldstein, Deputy Assistant Director of the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Both bureaus play a significant role in our government's response to the conflict in Sudan, and we welcome you here and look forward to your testimony. And if someone knows how to work the heat, we can maybe lower it. If they don't, then we'll just sweat. But anyway, welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, ask Feldstein
Sure.
first.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Pitts and Chairman McGovern and members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and thank you for the critical role the U.S. Congress continues to play in keeping a spotlight on Sudan. This hearing comes at a decisive moment for Sudan. There are persistent concerns about human rights abuses and violations, including targeted attacks against civilians in Darfur and the two areas, ongoing restrictions on fundamental freedoms throughout the country, and the risk that the African Union-led peace process and national dialogue will be sidelined in favor of planned national elections in April. Last week, February 21st to 26th, I undertook a human rights and democracy-focused trip to Sudan, the first visit by a senior U.S. human rights official to the country since 2011. The Sudanese government's welcoming of this visit represents an important first step to engage on our human rights and democracy priorities. Given Sudan's poor human rights record, some have asked what we hope to get out of such a visit. From my viewpoint, it is precisely because we have such significant concerns that traveling to Sudan and talking directly with Sudanese government officials was the right thing to do. In particular, I believe this trip represented an opportunity to initiate a frank conversation with the Sudanese government on a range of human rights issues, including aerial bombardment of civilians, lack of humanitarian access, restrictions on civil society and religious freedom, and ongoing detention and harassment of opposition members. It also provided a chance to emphasize to my Sudanese counterparts that any improvement in U.S.-Sudan relations and eventual change in policy must be premised on real and substantive improvements on key human rights and democracy issues. Our goal was to deepen the human rights conversation between our two countries. I want to be clear about whether this visit represents the beginning of a shift in U.S. policy towards Sudan. In reality, it is a continuation of our approach that the engagement of all parties in Sudan, including the government, is required to make progress to resolving the internal conflicts in the country. It is rooted in our effort to capitalize on the promise of comprehensive peace talks and national dialogue. The Sudanese government announced January 2014 it would hold a national dialogue to discuss democratic reforms, issue of identity, and political reconciliation. In addition, the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel, which is led by President Thabo Mbeki, is mediating a synchronized process to end the interrelated conflicts in Darfur and the two areas. These processes provide a viable pathway to attain comprehensive security and governance reforms needed to address the root causes of conflict in Sudan, and this opportunity must not be lost. During the trip, I met with a range of government officials to discuss our human rights agenda. This includes counterparts from the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, Justice, Guidance and Endowment, which oversees religious issues, the National Intelligence and Security Services, NIS, the Humanitarian Aid Commission, and many others. I also met with non-government Sudanese stakeholders without government presence or participation. This included members of civil society, human rights activists and defenders, journalists, opposition party members, youth activists, religious minorities, and women leaders. My intent was to hear their concerns and to underscore that the U.S. stands with the Sudanese people. I was also clear that I wanted to get out of Khartoum and visit Sudan's conflict-affected regions. I traveled to Blue Nile State, where I met with local officials, humanitarian actors, and internally displaced persons. But for an unexpected Sudanese dust storm, or Habub, I would have also traveled to IDP camps in Darfur. I would like to share 5 specific takeaways from the trip. First, conflict in Darfur and the two areas, the periphery of Sudan, continues unabated and is leading to significant human rights abuses and likely violations of international humanitarian law. Credible reports indicate that the government continues to indiscriminately and deliberately bomb civilian areas and undertake armed attacks on civilian and humanitarian targets in Darfur and the two areas. For example, as was mentioned in January 20th of this year, the Sudanese armed forces bombed the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in southern Kordofan, one of the reasons prompting MSF Belgium's pullout. The pervasiveness of the bombing campaign was driven home to me when, during a pre-trip Skype briefing with Nuba Reports director Ryan Boyette, I could literally hear an Antonov plane buzzing in the background. Ryan later informed us that that plane dropped 6 bombs on Haibin town, timed to coincide with its weekly market day, which draws hundreds of people from the region. So there is an abundance of evidence of ongoing scorched earth policies in Darfur and the two areas by the government's rapid support forces, along with other forces, including widespread sexual and gender-based violence. This, of course, includes our deep concern for reports of mass rapes in Tabet this past October. Second, Sudan is a security state, and this made itself very apparent throughout my visit. NIS monitored my activities and those that I came into contact with. Needless to say, such actions were a stark reminder of ongoing repressions of fundamental freedoms in the country. The security state restricts all form of dissent. Indeed, my arrival in Sudan was preceded by a crackdown on 15 media outlets. The government continues to restrict rights to freedom of expression, freedom of association, including arbitrarily detaining opposition members Amin Mekki Medani, Farouk Abu Isa, and Farah Ibrahim Mohammed Agar. During the trip, I strongly pressed for their imminent release or to at least visit one of the detainees. Regrettably, these efforts were unsuccessful, but we did have a chance to meet with their families and lawyers and express our deepest concern. Their continued detention calls into question the government's resolve to hold a comprehensive and inclusive national dialogue. Members of Sudan's human rights community and civil society highlighted harassment, intimidation, detention, and government restrictions on their ability to operate. They mentioned that freedom of religion or belief is under pressure and that churches and their members face closures, forced evictions, intimidation, onerous registration requirements, and blasphemy and apostasy laws. Third, I nonetheless believe it is a mistake to treat the government of Sudan as a monolith. I am convinced that pragmatic, even reform-minded factions do exist in the government and are quietly willing to serve as intermediaries and push behind the scenes for greater opening and a lessening of abuses. They are balanced out in equal, if not greater weight, by security hardliners. I believe we should continue pushing our message that no military solution exists to these conflicts, and that an end to the fighting brokered by the AU-HIP and an inclusive national dialogue is the best possible outcome for Sudan. Fourth, the United States has limited leverage to effect change in Sudan, but our extensive sanctions policy and subsequent international isolation is a huge thorn in the side of the government. The issue of sanctions was raised repeatedly by Sudanese officials, both in government and non-government meetings. Many asked bluntly if they could expect sanctions relief if they undertook hard policy choices. Successive Congresses and U.S. administrations have put in place a sanctions policy that correctly highlights the need to end the conflict and compel the government to engage in meaningful reforms. What really struck me is how much of an economic and political ripple effect our sanctions policies have on Sudanese from all walks of life. The U.S. government's recent issuance of a telecommunications general license that enables the export of certain personal telecommunications hardware and software has had and will have a powerful effect. Fifth and finally, just as our grave concerns about Sudan's human rights record colors our interactions with the government, the Sudanese have an equivalent deep-seated distrust and suspicion of U.S. intentions and policy. In countless meetings, they recount a litany of grievances, failed promises, and dashed expectations by the U.S. dating back to the 1990s and even before. We need to learn how to talk to one another again if we are ever to make progress on our key priorities and bring about constructive outcomes. So where do we go from here? I think we all agree that Sudan does not need more civil war. Throughout my visit, but particularly in Blue Nile State, people clearly and resolutely want an end to conflict and violence and are seeking peace. All sides owe it to the people of Sudan to make genuine good faith efforts to engage in the peace process. The government of Sudan repeatedly claimed throughout the trip that it is committed to peace and ending conflict, that it wants nothing more than to focus on developments for its people. We told them if their commitment to peace is sincere, then a necessary first step to break the impasse is to declare a unilateral ceasefire in all conflict areas. At the very least, the government should engage seriously in the next round of AU-HIP peace talks with the SPLM North and Darfuri armed movements who are aligned within a coalition of armed and unarmed groups known as the Sudan Revolutionary Front to lead to coordinated cessation of hostilities agreements. It is also clear that an inclusive and comprehensive political process is urgently needed to avoid future conflict and to address the crisis of governance that fuels civil wars in Sudan. Sadly, instead of focusing its efforts on putting together an inclusive, comprehensive national dialogue, the government has instead insisted on going forward with national elections scheduled for April 2015. When civil society, journalists, and opposition members are excluded from the political process and operate in an environment of violence and fear, elections carry little weight and even less legitimacy. Despite these obstacles, we are working aggressively in close cooperation with our international partners to support opposition and civil society participation in a national dialogue if and when it comes about. In closing, I want to emphasize that we are operating under no illusions. We recognize the gravity of the situation. I hope that my visit has contributed to creating a climate where real dialogue can take place on human rights. Certainly, we will continue to press for peace and an end to the violence. Finally, I would like to take a moment to recognize our U.S. mission in Sudan under Chargé Jerry Lanier's leadership. They are a dedicated corps of officers doing a remarkable job under tough and difficult circumstances. Every day they come in fighting on behalf of American values and principles. Often they face intransigent government officials, traumatized civil society activists and NGO contacts, and shadowy NIST agents lurking in the background. But they keep picking themselves up and moving forward. They deserve our commendation and respect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Pitts, and members of the Commission. Thank you for including me on this panel to review the humanitarian situation in Sudan and what the U.S. government is doing to mitigate the suffering of people who have fled violence. As other emergencies around the world grab international and public attention, this opportunity to highlight the challenges in Sudan is most welcome. At an earlier stage in my career, I spent several years working for the UN in Sudan, and I went to Darfur in 2004 during the initial phases of the emergency response to set up child protection programs. It was one of the most heartbreaking but also rewarding experiences of my career as an aid worker. And so 10 years later, it is tragic that the conflict persists and that camps for displaced people that were just being set up then have seemed to become permanent fixtures, and that the suffering continues for so many. In Sudan today, we are grappling with a set of interwoven humanitarian crises with multiple hotspots and new population displacement layered on top of protracted emergencies. Sudan not only generates large numbers of refugees and internally displaced persons, it also hosts large refugee populations from neighboring countries. These distinct groups of refugees and conflict victims require approaches that respond to their different situations. That said, there's a common thread among all, and that is the continued lack of adequate humanitarian access and cooperation from the various parties to the various conflicts. While we can cite some small elements of progress, they remain overshadowed by this fundamental challenge. We continue to press Sudanese authorities and opposition leaders, bilaterally, multilaterally, through the United Nations, through the African Union, from the highest levels of our government, through the program-focused efforts of our refugee officers, for the access and the adherence to humanitarian principles that are necessary for the international community to save lives and mitigate suffering. Though perhaps out of the news, Darfur remains a priority for the U.S. government. As you've noted in the announcement of this hearing, the humanitarian environment in Darfur has deteriorated over the last 2 years. Conflict between government forces and armed groups, as well as intercommunal conflict over limited resources, forced more than 450,000 people from their homes in Darfur in 2014, bringing the total number of internally displaced to over 2.4 million. Over the last 10 years, more than 360,000 Darfuris have sought refuge outside of Sudan in eastern Chad. While most would like to eventually return home, this prospect remains dim as the conflict continues. The allegations of mass rape in Tabit and subsequent efforts by the government of Sudan to prevent immediate access to enable a proper investigation are evidence of many persistent problems in Darfur, most importantly that women and girls are still not safe. We also remain gravely concerned about the worsening humanitarian situation in Sudan's southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states, also known as the two areas. The aerial bombardments that have been mentioned by both the Sudanese government and the fact that both the government and the SPLM North have used indirect fire against civilian targets. Too many innocent civilians, too many children, families have been killed, wounded, and displaced from their towns and villages. Humanitarian workers in the two areas also face significant risks amid this violence. We've noted the bombing of the MSF hospital. Also in January, rebel combatants forced down a World Food Program helicopter. In February, unidentified combatants killed 3 Sudanese Red Crescent workers. Since 2011, the crisis in the two areas has left more than 2 million people in need of assistance and forced more than 250,000 Sudanese to flee to South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya. In fiscal year 2014, the U.S. government provided nearly $298 million in humanitarian aid for conflict victims and displaced populations in Sudan through UN agencies, other international organizations, and non-governmental organizations. With our support, they continue to provide food, access to safe drinking water, sanitation services, programs to protect children, including reuniting families torn apart, nutrition, healthcare, and education services. We are helping millions of people. However, government-imposed restrictions on access and attacks on aid workers continue to make it difficult for humanitarian agencies to reach all of those who are in need. The United States also continues to fund the work of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and NGOs assisting long-staying Darfuri refugees in Chad, helping them to find ways to support themselves in a physical environment that is particularly inhospitable. Finding the financial and human resources to cope with protracted crises such as this one, frankly, is becoming more difficult, as humanitarians respond to ever more conflicts that have erupted or worsened around the world, displacing record numbers of people. We are in the process of ramping up our resettlement program for Darfuri refugees in Chad to the United States, recognizing that a home here may be the best and only solution for some of them. Sudanese refugees from the two areas who have fled to South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya, many of them arrive in poor condition. Our programs provide physical protection, shelter, food, water, and health services. The greatest challenge to protecting these Sudanese refugees, the ones particularly who have gone to South Sudan, is maintaining the security and the neutrality of refugee camps amidst an active war there. The SPLM North has forcibly recruited refugees to fight with them, including children, from the camps. The war in South Sudan has made maintaining the civilian character of these refugee camps even more challenging. We need to ensure that refugees have safe settlements that are away from volatile borders and out of the potential line of fire, that combatants are disarmed or separated from civilians, and that women and girls especially are safe from sexual assault and other violence. As I mentioned earlier, refugees flee into Sudan as well as out of it. As a result of South Sudan's current internal war, more than 120,000 South Sudanese have sought refuge in Sudan. The Sudanese government has not extended refugee status to this population, but it did sign a memorandum of understanding with UNHCR on the registration and documentation of all South Sudanese citizens in Sudan. This is an agreement that should provide legal status, including recognized and documented permission to stay, freedom of movement within Sudan, registrations of births, deaths, marriages, and divorce, the opportunity to work, and access to education and health care, along with other services provided to citizens of Sudan. So while this agreement is a step in the right direction for sure, we will need to watch closely to see how it is implemented. Sudan is also hosting more than 100,000 Eritrean refugees in the east in Kassala, Gadaref, and Khartoum states. New Eritrean refugees are arriving in Sudan at the rate of nearly 2,000 a month. Many Eritreans are moving through Sudan to Libya, often in the hands of brutal smugglers who abduct them, abuse them, and demand thousands of dollars in ransom to either release them or smuggle them onward to Europe. Too many then lose their lives attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea to Italy. The government of Sudan has signaled its interest in cooperating with the international community to combat human trafficking and smuggling. It passed an anti-trafficking law in 2013 and hosted the African Union's Regional Conference on Trafficking in October of last year. That conference led to one in Rome in November, where the European Union Horn of Africa Migration Route Initiative, also known as the Khartoum Process, was launched to tackle trafficking and smuggling of migrants between the Horn of Africa and Europe. The U.S. government, along with other donors, is funding UNHCR and the International Organization of Migration to work with the Sudanese government to increase the protection of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants who are at risk of abuse by smugglers and traffickers on their way into Sudan, through Sudan, and out of Sudan. There are also some signs of progress on access to Sudan for U.S. government humanitarian officials. While my visa request was politely denied several years ago, PRM officers have received permits in 2014 and 2015 to conduct program monitoring and evaluation trips in Eastern Sudan, Darfur, and White Nile, excuse me. The Sudanese Commissioner for Refugees recently invited our Assistant Secretary to visit. What matters even more, however, than our ability to visit is whether the organizations we count on to deliver humanitarian assistance to populations in need are able to do so consistently. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Access is variable, unreliable, particularly for international staff and those who are dedicated to protection programming. Expulsions of humanitarian staff and periodic suspensions of humanitarian operations by the Sudanese government continue to hamper the work of our implementing partners. The United States and the international community will continue to press the government of Sudan to depoliticize aid and allow immediate and unfettered humanitarian access. It goes without saying that the best way to end the human suffering in Sudan is for the warring parties to resolve their conflicts peacefully and for governments to respect the human rights of their citizens. But while we push for political solutions and improved governance, it is important to recognize that the U.S. government does play a vital role in continuing to seek protection and assistance for innocent civilians thrust into harm's way. Those imperiled and scattered by the violence rely on us, on our global humanitarian leadership, and specifically on the resources Congress provides to help them survive the danger and hardship they face today so that they can hope for the chance to rebuild their lives in the future. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and I also look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm going to be fairly brief because we may have a series of votes, so I want to make sure we get through this panel and hopefully get into the next panel before that. But Mr. Feldstein, I'm glad that you were able to get a visa to go to Sudan. I tried a few years ago, and I was denied in Washington. I tried when I was in Ethiopia to get one. I couldn't get one there. I tried in Kenya to get one. Couldn't get one there. So next time I'm going to drop your name and see whether they will relent and let me go in. I did several years back go to Chad and went to the refugee camps along the border. And I was there when the UN, when the International Criminal Court was actually taking testimony that ultimately led to the indictment of Bashir for these terrible, terrible crimes, and I saw the conditions in the refugee camp and the sheer numbers of refugees, and I was also there to witness a humanitarian crisis when the Janjaweed militia were chasing people who were actually in Chad, but were across the border into Chad, and were going after them. So this is I guess I want to begin by saying I appreciate your testimony, and I know everybody's working hard. But it's so frustrating to be here and repeating kind of the same opening statement that we've done on 5 different occasions. And I know this probably I know you don't. This is not against anybody here, but I kind of feel like the urgency on this issue, is not what it needs to be, given the enormity of the humanitarian crisis, given the enormity of the killing that's going on and the reports that we're getting out. Things seem to be getting worse. And so I appreciate, attempts to try to engage in in a dialogue, and I know, you were over there. We've had high-level Sudanese officials come here, but I'm just a little skeptical because I want to make sure that these visits aren't being used to kind of put forth a myth that somehow we're normalizing relations or that we're getting along or that things are moving forward when in fact they're not. And so I'm looking for timelines, benchmarks. How do we know whether or not anything good comes of your visit? I mean, you talked about a cessation of hostilities. How long are we going to give them? I'm just worried that, given Bashir's record, is that he's kind of dragging us along and saying, and doing the absolute minimum while, this ethnically targeted slaughter continues to go on and on and on and on. And I just think that we ought to be thinking of new ways to put pressure on this government, not alleviating the pressure, given all this going on. So, I mean, when are we going to get some good news? How long are we going to give the African Union to come up with some sort of a deal, or, how long are we going to wait? Is there a deadline or target are we waiting for before we say things that we're doing are working or things that we're doing are not working?
Well, thank you for the question, and I fully share the same concern that we have undertaken countless efforts to try to push on these issues, to try to push for peace, to try to push for an end to civilian killings, to push for an end for human rights violations, and that progress has been slow to come, if at all.
And the reports we're getting is that the violence is getting worse. And if you have different information, I'd like to know it. But I mean, those are the reports that we're getting. Things are getting worse, not that they're even staying at the same horrendous level. They're getting worse.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I think we're in in the next fighting season, in the midst of it right now, and so there are continuing and ongoing civilian bombings and the like. So I think certainly things are not better and potentially deteriorating even further. I mean, I would say in terms of the visit itself, I certainly don't think that we played into any of the narratives about normalization. In fact, the very first headline that came from the first day of my visit was the headline, Feldstein prohibited from visiting 3 detainees. So while that was a negative in terms of not being able to actually see those from the opposition who were imprisoned, on the other hand, the message was very clear that the number one message that we wanted to come out, at least from my perspective, was that we care about human rights issues, we're watching. Any prospect of any change in policy must be premised on something substantive and some real change.
Right, but I'll give you one example, and not with your visit, but when high-ranking Sudanese officials come here and some of us raise issues, I see in some of the press over there and some of the international press, that members of Congress complain, but Sudanese officials say they've been welcomed by the administration. As if somehow, those of us who are complaining about the terrible violence are not somehow in sync with what the administration's doing. So that's what I mean when I say that I want to make sure that we're not playing into their game of trying to get some international legitimacy, which is not deserved in any way, shape, or form, given their record. Those are the things that I worry about.
I think that's completely right, and we've been very careful to say that this visit doesn't represent any change in policy whatsoever. It's merely a communication and further dialogue on shared issues of concern and human rights and democracy issues that really are not going in any direction that we think are positive. I think, also we hope that, and one of the things I mentioned to Sudanese counterparts is that we do need to see something tangible, even if there's small steps initially. But we need to see something tangible, and we do need to get to some sort of cessation of hostility so that there is the right type of space to be able to talk in a more serious way. So we hope that will happen. We hope that further steps along those lines will occur. If not, then I think it was worth at least trying to communicate and push that. And I think, making sure that we've been very clear that this isn't a change in any sanctions policy. And that was asked repeatedly. Are we changing our sanctions policy? Is there something different? And we very definitively said, not at all. There is no change right now until conditions on the ground change. I think that was something that was heard well by counterparts.
Yeah, and let me just say, finally, just a suggestion. I think Secretary Kerry, I think the President of the United States ought to, use their bully pulpit to highlight for the world what continues to go on. I don't know what our conversations are with Russia or China and trying to put additional pressure, on the Sudanese government to stop the killing. But, I mean, the world ought to know what they're doing, and I think we have the biggest bully pulpit in the world. I mean, as part of a press conference, hold up a visual from as to what's going on, or some of the statistics, and remind the world community. I mean, this is a government that is that we say is guilty of genocide. This is a government where the president's been indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and genocide. I mean, and while I think it's worth exploring every effort to see whether or not we can work something out, I think we need to make sure that everybody knows that this is still going on. Because I'm going to tell you, and this is within some of our colleagues here, I gave a speech on the floor on this a few weeks ago, and a couple of people who were sitting on the floor said, geez, I remember what was going on in Darfur. I remember we had a group of college kids come in, but I thought that was getting better. We haven't heard very much about it. And that's partly our fault, but it's partly your fault too, and we need to get the administration to be more upfront on this. And some of us are looking at drafting additional legislation to tighten up the sanctions. We don't want the Sudanese government to know that we're letting them off the hook in any way, shape, or form. We'll work with you on that, but it is so frustrating to be here for the fifth time and not even to be able to report on any progress. Everything just is bad, if not worse, than ever before. And I think it's something the whole world community, quite frankly, the whole civilized world community should be ashamed of. Mr. Pitts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I concur with your sentiment. I was the one years ago in the International Relations Committee when Secretary of State Colin Powell was before us, who asked him the question and got him to say for the first time that what was occurring in Sudan was genocide. And so you have a very important role. The State Department has a very important platform that you need to continue to exercise to highlight what is happening there. Mr. Feldstein, when you asked them during your visit, or when you recommended to them, I think your quote was that they should unilaterally declare a ceasefire in the conflict areas. What was their response?
Thank you for the question. I mentioned this several times, and I didn't get a yes or a no, but I did get a sense that they would follow up in some way and take this under advisement. So it's something that I think from the department's perspective, we're waiting to see whether there's some movement in that direction, whether it comes through the AU HIP process or otherwise.
In your opinion, in order to increase the pressure, what should we as United States government, what should we, in considering increased sanctions, whatever, what would be the things that we should do to increase that pressure?
Thanks. I think there's a couple things that make sense. I think first of all, the power of the bully pulpit is an important one, and it was one that was just mentioned. But I think keeping this issue, the issue of atrocities, of civilian killings, and so forth, on the radar of the public is an important thing, because they hear very carefully and clearly the messages that come from the Congress, that come from advocacy groups and otherwise. It was very surprising to me just how often they would cite different advocates, including John Pendergrass, who will be in the next panel, and all the things that he's written, including the New York Times op-ed that came out last week. This is something that was almost discussed in every meeting that was there. So they very clearly hear that, and I think that's important. I think when it comes to the sanctions regime, I think we have a pretty strong sanctions regime at the moment, and I wonder if further sanctions are going to get us closer to the ultimate goal, which is ending civilian killings and human rights atrocities, bringing about peace, and hopefully setting the right conditions for a national dialogue. So I think that if you continue the pressure, you maintain the sanctions regime, you don't hold out any prospect for that changing until some of the key conditions that we've discussed are met, and you keep pressing over and over again with counterparts that these are the core interests that we have. I hope that will lead to better progress.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Weissner, how does the State Department coordinate its aid effort with USAID to ensure that as many people are helped as possible?
I can say confidently that we're really in lockstep with USAID. We have complementary programs that we work out with them on a regular basis. So from the senior levels to the working levels, we're aware of what they're funding, they're aware of what we're funding, and we're strategizing together on how we can best use U.S. government resources to respond to different needs and different populations.
With NGOs as well.
With NGOs as well, yeah. We have certain UN agencies that we each take the lead in funding, and then we compare all of our NGO funding as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let me just say, follow up on what Mr. Pitt said about increased sanctions. When you talk to the Sudanese government, let them know that we are drafting a bill to increase the sanctions, and if they don't want it, then they ought to start doing some of the things that you suggested. But if not, they could look forward to even more restrictive sanctions, because that's coming down the road. Ms. Schakowsky?
Actually, I'm going to see, a vote has been called, so I'm wondering if the next panel, if we have time for some testimony. What do you think instead?
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, we're gonna excuse you. We're gonna follow up with maybe some written questions, but I appreciate you being here. I appreciate what you're trying to do. And please understand our frustration. It's not meant personally, it's just that we've been doing this for a long time, and it's been 10 years since we've called this thing a genocide, and here we are. So, but thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you. And I hope that you'll get copies of the testimony from Tom Andrews and Jonathan Loeb and John Prendergast as well, because I think they have a good perspective on this. And I also have testimony from Eric Reeves, professor of Smith College, who couldn't be with us today, but who's been very outspoken on this for many, many years. So thank you. So what we will call now the Honorable Tom Andrews, a former member of the House of Representatives from Maine, who currently serves as the President to End Genocide. Jonathan Loeb, a fellow with the African Division of Human Rights Watch, and John Prendergast, who is the founding director at the Enough Project. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I think we should at least try to get through the opening statements if we can, and then some of us will come back. So Tom, why don't we begin with you?
It's on now. Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, members of the Commission. Congressman Pitts, welcome, congratulations, and Congresswoman Schakowsky, it's wonderful to see you as well. Thank you so much for holding this hearing. It is so important that the Congress hear your voices, that the Congress provide leadership that I believe is lacking from the United States government. It is very important that the frustration and the concerns that you have raised, Mr. Chairman, be raised forcefully, very vocally, here in Washington and across this country and across this world. This is extremely important because the stakes are extremely high. I'm not going to review, you'll see in my testimony, the recitation of the alarming facts that, as you recognize, are bad and getting worse. We haven't seen this level of violence and atrocities since this was declared a genocide years ago. But I want to identify two major factors that are driving these atrocities. The first, of course, is the impunity of the regime behind this brutality, the regime of Omar al-Bashir, who is the president. I'm getting some feedback here. Maybe it's just the loudness of my voice. I'll try to. But it's the impunity of the leader of this regime that is behind all of this, who's the president of Sudan and also, as you noted, wanted for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes by the International Criminal Court. But the second factor is the failure of the United States of America, the United Nations, and the international community as a whole to respond adequately to this deepening crisis. The pattern that we are witnessing right now is eerily similar to the pattern that preceded the Darfur genocide more than a decade ago, In short, the steady escalation of the brutal and systematic violence against defenseless people as the world and those who are in positions to act turn away. We fully realize how full your plate is, how many issues, both foreign and domestic, that you're confronting. We're not going to see a joint session of Congress to confront this particular issue. But as you pointed out, there is a crisis that is deepening that demands action. We have to hold Omar al-Bashir and his regime accountable, but we also have to be held accountable. Bashir's brutality is enabled by our inaction and our silence. Those who are in positions to act are simply failing. And as you know, there is a great deal at stake. May I simply add that the systematic use of food and medicine as weapons of war, the bombing of fields, of field crops in Sudan, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile, is atrocious. And the bombing of hospitals, the use of medicine and food as weapons of war is just absolutely incredible. And in addition, there are credible allegations that Sudan is arming South Sudanese rebels. Instability and violence on either side of the border, of course, has led to large refugee flows going back and forth. Meanwhile, this long and growing list of atrocities, and you expressed your frustration, Mr. Chairman, continually are met with tired messages of regret and condemnation that are undermined by counterproductive actions on every level. Despite the spike in violence at the hands of the Bashir regime, for example, the United States government recently welcomed a top advisor to Sudanese President Bashir to Washington to meet with White House and State Department officials, and allowed the foreign minister of Sudan to attend the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington just a few weeks ago. Action speaks louder than words, and all of the words of regret and condemnation are undermined by actions such as these and the actions that you discussed earlier in the panel. We, as an organization at United to End Genocide, were very disappointed that the Sudan Peace, Security, and Accountability Act, led by you, Mr. Chairman, in the last Congress and championed by members of this commission, failed. We were encouraged by the tens of thousands of our members and supporters who supported that legislation. We were proud of the more than 100 congressional co-sponsors who stood behind that legislation. And we are hopeful that you and this commission and the Congress of the United States can reintroduce this type of comprehensive legislation that hits all the major points that we are making today. There are 5 major things that I think are needed. 1, there needs to be a call for strong U.S. leadership and voices in the UN Security Council. Right now, the talk is clicking on the mandate for peacekeepers, the so-called UNAMID, the cooperative arrangement between the United Nations and the African Union, in their project in Darfur. June 30th, the mandate will run out. Omar al-Bashir is calling for the removal of these peacekeepers. What has been the response? Nearly 800 positions within UNAMID have now been eliminated. We are talking about the expiration of the mandate, and the United Nations and the Security Council are making plans right now to exit. An exit strategy is underway for these peacekeepers. We need, Mr. Chairman, an action strategy, not an exit strategy, to confront the crisis that is going on in Sudan right now. Secondly, we have to strengthen the effectiveness of existing sanctions. I outline how in my written testimony. We have to expand the sanctions, not just enforce, but expand the sanctions, and I described that in my testimony. We need to demand accountability from those who aid and abet Bashir and his reign of terror, whether they be private institutions or governments, including those that welcome him into their country. He traveled to 9 different countries last year. He was in the United Arab Emirates 2 days ago to attend an arms bazaar, and nothing is said, even when our strong allies and those who are recipients of U.S. aid welcome him to their country, the United States is silent. And finally, we need to have a comprehensive strategy, as outlined in the legislation, to deal with these atrocities in not a piecemeal way, in not a reactive way, but in a very comprehensive way. I urge this committee to speak loudly and clearly to the administration, particularly as the clock is ticking on the United Nations Security Council mandate right now. I would ask you to hold Omar al-Bashir and his accomplices accountable by raising questions in committee deliberations, on the floor of a House, when foreign policy questions are discussed, when aid questions are discussed. Make this an issue. And finally, may I request that this commission exert the leadership that you did last session in reintroducing this important legislation. I commit to you the efforts of my organization and many thousands of people across this country who will do everything possible to see that it's passed. Thank you so much for your leadership and your willingness to hold this hearing.
Mr. Loeb?
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Pitts, members of the committee, thank you for organizing this hearing. I was asked to speak about the allegations of mass rape in the town of Tabet in North Darfur. I'm going to keep my remarks brief and ask that the Human Rights Watch report, Mass Rape in Darfur, be submitted for the record.
I don't think your mic is on, is it? Okay.
Hello?
Yep, there you go.
Okay. After more than 12 years of conflict in Darfur, the human rights situation remains dire. Very recently, the UN panel of experts on Darfur released a report stating that over 3,000 villages had been burned by government forces in Darfur in 2014, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced as a result of these attacks. Gathering precise information on the human rights abuses that occurred during these attacks and other attacks against civilians in Darfur by all sides has been extraordinarily difficult. The government of Sudan has systematically denied access to Darfur to all international human rights organizations and all independent journalists. It also has consistently prevented UNAMID human rights investigators from carrying out on-site investigations of attacks and human rights abuses across Darfur. Because of these obstructions, Human Rights Watch and other organizations have had to rely on remote research methods in order to document events in Darfur. This includes telephone interviews with victims and witnesses inside Darfur and in-person interviews with those who fled to neighboring countries. And people who are still in Sudan who've chosen to speak with us have done so at great risk to their own personal safety. In October and November, I traveled to eastern Chad with a colleague, visited several refugee camps, informal sites, and towns to interview men and women who had fled from these recent attacks in Darfur. Many of the victims and witnesses I interviewed reported that their villages had been attacked by the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, which is a newly formed paramilitary force under the direct command of the Sudanese government and specifically the National Intelligence and Security Services. They said that these forces carried out killings and other abuses and looted and burned their villages, forcing families to flee. Several women told me that they made perilous journeys through the desert without food or water. We also heard accounts of large numbers of rapes committed by government soldiers. One 20-year-old woman told me that during a government attack on her village, she escaped by climbing a tree with her 1-year-old child on her back. While she was hiding in this tree, she witnessed soldiers rape and then kill 6 women from her town. Dozens of other refugees relate similar stories to me. In early November, while I was conducting this research in Chad, Radio de Banga, a Netherlands-based radio station that reports on Darfur and broadcasts in Darfur, reported allegations of 200 women being raped in one town in North Darfur called Tabet in one evening. In the following days, Radio de Banga and other local Sudanese media stations continued to report on this incident. The government had reportedly cut off all access to the town, and even UNAMID, which has 2 large bases fairly close to the town, was unable to gain access. Given this lack of access, I decided to speak with residents of the town by phone with the assistance of some of my Sudanese colleagues. We found witnesses to the incident to be extraordinarily difficult to locate and fearful of speaking. However, the course of approximately 2.5 months, we were ultimately able to interview about 50 foreign and current residents of the town, including 18 female victims, 15 of them who reported to me that they had been raped. Through these accounts and through accounts from these victims and witnesses, we were able to determine that over the course of a 36-hour period, beginning on the 30th of October, Sudanese army troops carried out 3 distinct attacks on the town of Tabet. No rebel forces were reported in this town. These attacks included the mass rape of women and girls, the arbitrary detention, beating, and ill treatment of scores of people. Sudanese government forces carried out the rapes and other abuses during 3 distinct attacks on Thursday, Friday morning, and again Friday evening into Saturday night. Witnesses told me that during each of these attacks, government soldiers essentially went house to house, searching these houses on the pretense of looking for a missing soldier, then severely beating the men and forcing them to locations on the outskirts of town, and then proceeding to rape nearly all the remaining women.
Hey, let me just interrupt you briefly, because I'm told we're out of town time to vote. So we're gonna come right back to you. We're gonna go vote and come back.
Okay.
All right, so hold it, right there. Oh, boy, all right. Well, the hearing's going to reconvene now. Please feel free to take your jackets off. And, is he coming back? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, we're back. And Mr. Loeb, we interrupted you, so why don't you finish your testimony?
Thank you. Okay.
And make sure your mic's on, too. There you go.
So basically, I was just describing what happened during these attacks, and what the witnesses and the victims told me was that during each of these 3 attacks that were carried out by government forces, soldiers went house to house, searching the houses under the pretense of looking for a missing soldier, looting property, severely beating residents, and raping women and girls. On the 2 nights, soldiers forced many of the men to outdoor locations on the outskirts of the town, leaving the women and children especially vulnerable. Soldiers detained these men en masse and threatened and physically abused them throughout the night. Some of the residents we interviewed recognized some of the soldiers as those stationed among the Sudanese armed forces who are based just outside the town. And 2 soldiers, we managed to track down 4 defectors who from the Sudanese army. 3 of these defectors reported to me that they participated in the attack, and 2 soldiers who participated in the attack and later defected to a rebel group said that they had been given orders by senior commanders to rape women. One had received that order from a commander on the base just outside of the town. Another had received that order from a commander who traveled with some soldiers from El Fasher, the capital of North Darfur, just prior to the attack. So I just want to draw your attention to one victim. I interviewed a mother in her early 40s who told me that soldiers came into her house and raped her and her 3 daughters, 2 of whom were under the age of 11. She said, immediately after they entered the room, they said, "You killed our man. We're going to show you true hell." They started beating us. They took my husband away while beating him. They raped my 3 daughters and me. Some of them were holding the girl down while another one was raping her. They did it one by one. In total, I interviewed 15 survivors of rape, and these survivors, together with eyewitnesses, provided firsthand information about 27 accounts of rape, and they, along with 23 other sources, gave information about an additional 194 incidents of rape, and altogether we collected information about 221 women and girls who were allegedly raped. Those who carried out and ordered these rapes and other abuses are responsible for war crimes. Based on the testimony and other evidence, Human Rights Watch has determined that the mass rape in Tabet was part of a widespread and systematic attack on a civilian population and may amount to crimes against humanity. It's important to note that the complete list of women and girls who were raped or subjected to sexual violence by Sudanese military in Tabet will not be known until independent and credible and impartial investigators with expertise in sexual and gender-based violence are granted unfettered access to the town under circumstances where residents feel safe to share their experiences without fear of retaliation. Since the attacks, Sudanese government officials, military commanders, and traditional leaders responsible for the area around Tabet have taken drastic measures to prevent information about the attacks and other abuses from becoming public. They have threatened, intimidated, beaten, detained, and tortured residents of Tabet to prevent them from speaking out about what took place. They have not allowed any investigators to access the town. The government did allow UNAMID peacekeepers one very short visit, but they were accompanied by government security personnel, and we believe that this investigation was in no way credible. Victims and witnesses told us that they were instructed by local authorities not to speak about the crimes. After the visit, authorities denied all subsequent requests by UNAMID and other investigators, and to this day, the victims in Tabet are still living in fear of further attacks. Many of the perpetrators remain based immediately outside the town. So Human Rights Watch is urging the U.S. government and other members of the UN Security Council to take concrete steps to help protect civilians in Darfur from further abuse. and to ensure their access to medical care and to see those responsible for crimes are brought to justice. UNIMID should be supported to establish a permanent presence in Tabit, such as an operating base, and to carry out proactive patrols in and around the town to protect civilians. Chairman McGovern, my sincere thanks once again for giving me the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prendergast.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for your and the Commission's commitment to the people of Sudan. I want to jump right in and address your plea earlier, your appeal for new ideas, for fresh approaches to Sudan. After studying this regime for 25 years, it's my conclusion that the Khartoum government is most vulnerable to targeted, focused, and relentless economic and financial pressure. Therein lies the greatest opportunity for American leverage to be deployed in support of peace and human rights in Sudan. They've written off the rhetoric that this administration and others have, they just discounted it, as I think Tom Andrews said so eloquently in his testimony. Given the time constraints, I want to be really specific about what these financial and economic measures might be. And I'd focus on two particular pressure points that could constrict the resources that are available to the Sudanese regime and create a cost for doing business, for international actors doing business with the Sudanese government-related entities and individuals. The first pressure point is designating Sudanese gold as conflict affected. When South Sudan won its independence in 2011, Sudan lost its biggest source, or part of its biggest source of foreign exchange, oil. As a result, new gold discoveries have become basically the new oil for Sudan. The IMF thinks that Sudan imported or exported about almost $1.25 billion worth of gold last year in 2014. Much of that gold is coming from Darfur and other conflict zones where the government has consolidated its control over those gold mines, in part fueled by violent ethnic cleansing in the gold mining areas by army troops and government-supported militias, particularly in North Darfur, where the bulk of the gold from Darfur comes from. Musa Hilal, a man who we all remember from being the vanguard of the Janjaweed forces back in the last decade, is now benefiting from burgeoning gold production. In early 2013, his troops swept into this area of North Darfur, pillaged the artisanal mining community, and forced tens of thousands of people to flee for their lives, dramatically altered the ethnic dynamics of the town. Those same forces continue to benefit from this gold as they tax all the gold that comes from the area. So we would propose the following specific congressional actions on gold exports. First, members of Congress, led by this commission, should introduce a congressional resolution that simply spells out how Sudan's gold trade is conflict affected and a major factor in continuing the destabilization of Darfur, especially in light of this connection to Musa Hilal, who is on the U.S. sanctions list. The resolution could call on key gold industry associations to undertake due diligence to ascertain what gold that is coming from Sudan is actually conflict affected. Second thing we propose Congress doing on gold is, given the gravity of the threat that the gold trade presents, Congress should expand the scope of Sudan's sanctions outlined in the 2006 Darfur Peace and Accountability Act that you referenced earlier to specifically include provisions that would allow the imposition of sanctions on traders, officials, and armed leaders benefiting from the conflict-affected gold trade from Darfur. We also outlined some actions the executive branch could take in the written testimony, but I'll skip to the second major pressure point that we believe is available to the U.S., and that is enhancing the sanctions on middlemen and enablers, facilitators for the Sudanese economy. Sanctions, here's the problem. Sanctions have been unevenly imposed and very little enforced by the international community to have any kind of serious impact on the calculations of senior officials within the Sudanese regime. The U.S. and other countries should significantly enhance enforcement efforts as a means to pressure Khartoum on both human rights and peace issues. Most importantly, the next wave of U.S. sanctions, which hopefully will be spurred on by the bill that you guys are putting together now, should target the facilitators and the enablers who underpin the movement of funds on behalf of the regime. This would include Sudanese banks and international banks that do business with them, directly or indirectly through correspondent banking relationships. The recent fine on the French bank, BNP Paribas, is a model, I think, for what we can do here that would have an enormous impact, a very negative impact on the Sudanese government's economy, Sudanese government's financial situation. We propose the following legislative actions to enhance sanctions, in addition to, and again, aligning myself with Tom, supporting in no uncertain terms your coming bill. We will put all of our assets and resources behind the bill that emerges from this commission and your good work. I have 2 global actions and 2 Sudan-specific actions that can help strengthen sanctions. On the global side, Mr. McGovern, you've been an initial co-sponsor for the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. Ensuring those that are guilty of human rights abuses and facilitating the proceeds of corruption on behalf of governments are denied visas to the United States and have their assets frozen. Applying that to the Sudan is going to be really important. Having that new tool, which allows us to look at all of Sudan rather than just the Darfur-specific sanctions, will be crucial. And so getting behind that bill and getting as many co-sponsors as we can for the global bill would be terribly important. A second global recommendation that would have an impact on, very big impact on Sudan's economic and financial situation is supporting legislation, which hasn't yet been introduced in the House, to increase corporate transparency, to ensure that information about the ultimate owners of companies, they call them the beneficial owners of shell companies, to know that. These shell companies are being abused by corrupt officials who undertake financial dealings with the Sudanese regime. It's a global phenomenon, but it has real specific impact in Sudan. The first Sudan-specific recommendation we make would be for this commission to ask the administration to codify, we're getting into the wonky weeds here, but to codify the expansion of existing sanctions in the executive order of this administration, the grave human rights abuses via information technology executive order, to expand it from Iran to cover also Sudan, to cover foreign persons who have facilitated deceptive transactions for or on behalf of the government of Sudan as it seeks high-tech tools to spy on its own people and undermine the civil society organizations in Sudan. Very specific thing, can have an impact on the ground. And then finally, the second Sudan-specific recommendation is for this committee to send a letter to this commission to send a letter to President Obama and put in the bill to ask the administration to allocate actual resources to increase Sudan's sanctions enforcement capacity. They're not enforcing the sanctions. I was the initial author of the 1997 executive order when I worked in the White House that started the sanctions regime in Sudan. There's almost no resources to be used to enforce it. So companies simply change their name and they're no longer a sanction. Same people, same boards of directors, stuff like that. So I'm not accusing OFAC and Treasury and Justice for not following up. They have Russia, they have North Korea, they have Iran, they have all these other global issues that they have to track. But a little support for Sudan enforcement could go a very, very long way. As you expand what sanctions, because if you expand them and they don't enforce them, it doesn't mean anything. That's why it's really important to connect the two dots for real impact on the ground in Sudan and real impact on the calculations of the government of Sudan at the bottom, at the end of the day. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for your testimony. I apologize for the break. We originally weren't supposed to have votes till later, but everybody's afraid of the snow, so we moved everything up. They should come to Massachusetts. That's not an issue. As I explained to the administration panel, if there's a way to work out some sort of an agreement, that's real, that stops this killing, that protects people. I mean, I think I'm certainly interested in that. But kind of the history has been that we talk about negotiations and we go over, we visit, someone comes over here, and what we're seeing is that Bashir continues to impose a military solution while we're diddling around talking about dialogue. And I'm always a big believer in talking, but on the other hand, there's a point when you have to realize it's either producing something or not. And so I appreciate all the suggestions, and I think we will follow up on those suggestions. But one of the things that I've heard from some in the, not everybody, but some in the administration who have cautioned about increased sanctions is they say, well, if you tighten up the sanctions and you destabilize the government, then, they might collapse, and then you're in a situation where you have a country that has no government or no, there's no structure, and that'll even be worse for us. What do you say to that?
I think you also have some too. Real quick, I would say this has been a worry of everyone, and the discontinuities within the Sudan opposition and the gulf between the opposition and the civil society, the unarmed opposition, the civil society groups and the independent sector in Khartoum and other parts of Sudan. But I do think there has been a tremendous, that assessment was made a decade ago.
Right.
And there have been a lot of investments made by a number of governments around the world. And you've seen one in this last week by the German government, where efforts have been, a great deal of investment has been made in building the capacity on the political side, the non-military side of the opposition and the civil society elements, to be able to become a more coherent actor in a potential post or transitional arrangement, post-NCP or transitional arrangement that would occur. I have more confidence today than I did 5 or 10 years ago that there is more coherence within opposition elements and more dialogue that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago between elements who are in opposition to the government, but on the Islamist side of the table, they've just fallen out of a power struggle, not because they disagree ideologically with the regime, and other opposition groups. So there are openings there and cohesion there that didn't exist before, which I think needs to be factored when making an assessment of what would happen indeed if this regime collapsed.
Tom?
Well, Jim, as you know, nothing that we do will be risk-free.
Right.
I mean, there's always the chance of risk, but doing nothing or continuing to do what we're doing is obviously generating horrific consequences. So I think taking calculated risks to pressure this government to stop this horror, particularly giving some of the alternative ways that we can make sure that there is stability and security there, is worth it. And I think I would respond by saying, just look at the direction of this country. Look at the escalation of violence. Obviously, what we're doing now is not working. So it's the risk that we run by continuing on the way we are is completely unacceptable.
Mr. Loeb, I mean, the things that you type on your testimony are absolutely horrifying, and I'm just curious, how high-ranking are the commanders who gave the orders or would give the orders to rape in Tibet? Should we look at these orders as being representative of the Sudanese government's position, or are they a result of commanders knowing that there's no oversight, and there'll be no punishment, or, I mean, how should we view this terrible human rights atrocity?
Unfortunately, we don't know how high up the chain of command the orders came from. We don't believe in any way that it was a group of rogue soldiers. This was a systematic and organized attack. The two defectors that we spoke to said they were given orders. One was given orders by a senior commander on the base, and another was given orders by a more senior commander who traveled from the North Darfur capital of El Fasher. So we believe that they come reasonably high up the chain of command, but we're not sure exactly how high.
And there's been no consequence for anybody who's been involved in this?
To the best of our knowledge, there's been no consequence. We believe that certain soldiers and perhaps certain commanders have been transferred to other bases, but we are not aware of any sort of accountability on any level.
And just going back to the administration's testimony, I mean, we are engaged in a policy where we had an official go over there and meet with them, and we've had Sudanese officials come here and meet with people, and I guess how long does this go on before we say this ain't working, or this isn't producing anything, or, I mean, how do you measure success or lack thereof in this approach that we're now pursuing? Because here we are 10 years later. And one thing's been constant is, the government of Sudan. I mean, this has been the same government, and, they're still there, still doing horrible things. And I'm just, I just want to make sure we're not getting sucked into, as a country, this, we'll invite you over here, and you can invite us over there, and we'll keep on inviting each other back and forth and say we're going to listen to each other, but nothing ever changes. How do we measure whether any of this is worth it or not? Tom?
Mr. Chairman, I think the questions that you put to the administration witnesses were just exactly the kind of questions, and this question is exactly what the kind of questions we need to be putting to the administration, because it's not working. It is failing, and the trajectory is in absolutely the opposite direction. The violence is spiking upward. I mean, this is not a status quo situation. The violence is spiking upward, the impunity is spiking upward, but the response by the international community is going in exactly the opposite direction. Omar al-Bashir says we want the peacekeepers out. So what do? 800 positions are eliminated, and we start drawing up plans for an exit strategy. Yeah, okay. Thanks. Hopefully it's not my voice. We, as you say, we invite these officials here, we go there, we talk, we engage, we lift some sanctions, as opposed to enforcing our existing sanctions, as opposed to broadening our sanctions. And the thing is that we know that pressure works. The other element of this is that there are aiders and abettors of the Bashir regime. And we need to be approaching and focusing and pressuring them as well. When Chairman Wolf, a few years ago, went after, he challenged Malawi when it welcomed Omar al-Bashir to its country. And he challenged the Millennium Challenge Corporation support for Malawi. And that, just raising that question and putting pressure on and questioning our relationship to Malawi, the response was the government of Malawi did not invite Omar al-Bashir to a conference that he was scheduled to go in the next year. In fact, they didn't have the conference because it would mean welcoming Omar al-Bashir to their country. And there's some other incidences of that. So pressure works. This accommodation, these signals, this action that signals that things are normalizing or heading in that direction, I think are lethal.
Just to add to Tom's points, I would say that the dialogue in and of itself is not problematic. The U.S. and Soviet Union had a substantial dialogue at the height of the time when nuclear missiles were aimed at each other. What is connected to the dialogue is the question. The problem is what you were getting at in your questioning of the witnesses, as Tom said. And to me, we are basically supporting a peace process through the African Union and setting it up for failure because that peace process has no leverage. There is simply no peace. We know of much higher negotiations, much higher order negotiations that are occurring now on Iran, that without real serious leverage. What did the United States do for the last 5 years? We put every conceivable screw that we could and turned it as hard as we could on the Iranian economy to get to the point, whether you agree or not with whether the negotiations, to have the Iranians at the table thinking about possibly doing anything resulted from that kind of pressure. We're not doing any of that on Sudan. And so it's really, and Sudan is exposed quite substantially to the international financial system. Much of the international financial system goes through U.S. dollars, goes through New York, goes through London. These tremendous potential pressure points that we could be using, leverage we could use. And I want to just echo Tom Andrews' point about pressure working. Like, you can look through the history of the relationship between the United States and Sudan during this regime and find examples when there actually was substantial pressure placed, when there was an effort to bring international pressure to bear on the Sudan government, that they actually altered their behavior. In 1997, when I worked in the White House, there was a substantial, 96 and 97, substantial effort to work through the United Nations Security Council to press the Sudanese government to remove bin Laden, to address the quite enormous ties that the Sudanese government had been developing with a number of terrorist groups, and that had impact. They altered their strategies, they altered their policies. In 2003, 4, and 5, the Bush administration placed a tremendous, and internationally, there was a tremendous, and the Congress particularly placed a tremendous amount of pressure on Sudan that helped lead, it was a factor in leading to the 2005 peace agreement between the North and South Sudan. Of course, there's things you can criticize about that, but it demonstrates the principle. And then finally in 2010, the latter half of 2010, President Obama personally, and John Kerry when he was senator, and this House placed a tremendous amount of pressure on China and Egypt and Russia and a number of other countries to place pressure on Sudan to allow that referendum to occur and not to allow the country to be plunged back into war. Again, Sudan government, which was going to undermine that referendum, allowed it to happen because of international pressure. There are things you can do. So I could end where I started. Empty dialogue, just for dialogue's sake, is going to have no impact. Having a peace process run from the AU with no leverage will have no impact. We need to create leverage. It doesn't grow on trees. You have to create it.
Jan?
Thank you. Thanks to this amazing panel. It seems to me, in answer to the response that you get from the administration, the very idea that the things that we're talking about are going to bring down the government in Khartoum. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of things that you're talking about that we can do that are well short of that could have an effect. So I think to be told, well, we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that because a government beyond al-Bashir would be much worse, I think is not the real topic of discussion. What you're telling us here today is that there are a number of things that Congress can do. I want to talk to you, Tom, about this idea of, I mean, if the administration is having representatives from Khartoum as guests of the United States, have we sent public letters protesting that, or even saying, you know, we think it's not a good idea to bring this rogue government officials here, but if they do, these are the questions that should be asked. These are the things that we should be demanding of them. This should be the agenda. You talked about letters that the Malawi. Did you mention that, Tom? Or okay, the Malawi example. You know, some are letters, statements by Congress short of legislation, although we certainly can talk about that. Are they effective? I mean, is it heard worldwide in the countries that we're targeting in Sudan? Does it matter?
Yes, in a word, yes. I was amazed, frankly, as I travel around the world. People, when I've testified before Congress in various forums, people listen. People hear it. It's reported and it's discussed, and sometimes much to the chagrin of some of the people that I'm meeting. But it really does have an impact. And if it's done on a systematic basis, if people are held accountable and the voices are raised, and there's a variety of ways from the floor of the House to committees to letters,
Right.
to signing on. I mean, we have a thing called Bashir Watch, where we watch as he travels around the world and call out for those countries welcoming him and inviting him to meet their treaty obligations and arrest him. And if they don't, to raise questions in bodies like the United States Congress about the U.S. relationship to those countries.
I'm just wondering if the commission could have a more systematic way of tracking that kind of thing and weighing in as we go.
Yeah, and I think that's a good suggestion. We have complained, you mentioned the prayer breakfast, and we raised that issue. We were told that the administration does not invite people to the prayer breakfast. That's a separate thing entirely, although they did say they invited these officials to come here for ongoing talks about their dialogue, with the dialogue. But that's an example where, where we criticized them, and it was reported there in their press. But the administration's response was used to kind of show that there's a kind of a chasm between what we think and what they think. And look, I'm not against dialogue, but it's going to produce something. And while you're having this dialogue, you ought to be, turning up the heat to make sure they get the message. The concern is not going to go away. The sanctions aren't going to go away. They get worse until the human rights situation begins to improve. I mean, that's the price. That's the deal. And we all need to be saying that together. And that's why I suggest the president or the vice president or the secretary of state ought to take their public opportunities that they have, many of which, when they talk about human rights, to mention what is happening here, to show a picture, to talk about the terrible atrocities, the rapes that have been going on, and that the world community at a very minimum needs to speak out more loudly on this, I think. But I think we can do a better job of kind of.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, we can't control everybody, including the administration, all the time, but we can take responsibility ourselves for certain things. And I really want to thank this panel for making concrete suggestions, from legislation all the way to a variety of other things. And I think consistency on our part would be helpful. Admittedly, it's hard. I mean, there are so many things happening all over the world where we do want to weigh in. But I went with Leader Pelosi, I guess she was Speaker Pelosi, in 2006 or 2007, it must have been, to Darfur, to North Darfur. Are those people still living in those little tents that I saw 9 years ago? I mean, is that, it's just, do you know, Mr. Loeb?
I mean, for example, the refugees in Chad, there's about 360,000 there now, but about 250,000 of those have been there for about a decade now, if not more. I mean, we're in the 13th year of the conflict.
With the IDP camps, too.
The IDP camps, definitely. I mean, there have been some returns, and there have been people who've returned and then been displaced again. But the
I
majority.
think of the little kids that I saw, the 2-year-olds, who would now be.
Yeah, there's a generation of children in Darfur who've grown up in the IDP camps.
The number of new displacements over the last 2 years far outstrips the number of people who have returned from those camps that you visited to their areas of origin. So the numbers continue to blossom.
And the other thing, I mean, I think the Bipartisan Women's Caucus is very interested in rape, and on the kind of scale that you're talking about, and so there may be ways to segment some of these issues in terms of messaging and in terms of action that we can take, that I think suggests that we could be more strategic in thinking about how we address this, because I couldn't agree more with our chairman. The same opening statements year after year after year, and it does seem to be getting worse. We met with al-Bashir we went with the vice president when we were there, and there was such a cavalier attitude. As I recall, he pointed to, well, you've got Guantanamo or something, don't talk to me because look at what you do. I mean, it was, not taking any responsibility or feeling accountable for anything that was going on there. It was really pretty insulting. And it seems that the impunity issue is obviously deadly. Yeah, thank you.
And we know, just to put a fact on the table, sorry, we know that 40,000 additional people have been displaced since the 1st of January. And those are confirmed. There are additional reports of an additional 60,000 that have yet to be fully confirmed, but there are reports of, between confirmation and reports, we're talking 100,000 people since the 1st of January.
Of
New.
this year.
Yes, in Sudan, of new, in Darfur. of new people who have been displaced.
Anybody else want to?
One last point about Congress's voice. I think there's some value in the people who are in Darfur, Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile, and parts of South Sudan when you guys speak out forcefully, just that they know they're not forgotten. I don't think that's meaningless. But more importantly, when you speak out,
And the message gets to them, they know.
because of Radio Dabanga and other forms of communication, when there is a big congressional action, well, big in the sense of African, they'll find out about it, or word will spread about it. And then secondly, I think more importantly, here, is that when you speak out, it is connected to real action.
Right.
So this bill that you guys are putting together now, having as many teeth as possible in that bill, the Sudanese government has basically discounted like a stock who's already reported its earnings. They know when the U.S. talks tough about Sudan, they haven't been doing anything to back it up. So when Congress comes with a bill that will have real teeth in it and then speaks out, and you connect it to that, and you work through the other caucuses and other interested coalitions within Congress to get as many co-sponsors as we can, and then maybe find a way to get it through Congressman Royce's committee. I think that's going to have a potentially major impact on U.S. policy and on Sudanese government's calculations.
Let me ask one more. Are there any corporate actors, private sector actors that a little light, or a lot, but even a little light shown on them would be useful?
U.S. corporate or any international corporate?
Any.
The international banks, yeah, this is what,
This is on the gold stuff?
on a variety of sanctions busting. About 6 months ago, I'm always bad at dates, the bank, French bank BNP Paribas was fined a record $9 billion roughly because of its sanctions busting. It's so profitable for these banks to go around to try to hide what they're doing. People pay huge premiums who are on sanctions lists. Governments pay huge premiums. And so they're constantly, with real enforcement capacity, constantly finding that these people, that the banks are often going around. So the existing sanctions and regulations. So that fine and that kind of action could be followed up by a number of other banks that are complicit in connections with Sudanese banks or correspondent banks that are connected to Sudan. I think that's a real serious
I think
thing.
there's a number of pressure points that maybe we could just do a better job of honing in on. Thank you.
We have a number of new assignments. Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for, this was a busy day, but thank you so very much for engaging in this. And again, I reaffirm my sense of responsibility to be a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, being reminded of the iconic figure of which this was named. And I'm delighted that Congressman McGovern and myself and Congressman Schakowsky and others know the seriousness of keeping this Human Rights Commission strongly looking at issues. And do something a little unusual. Are there any persons here from Sudan in the room? Thank you, sir. Let me, with a little sense of recognition that these kinds of hearings are not pleasant, I could tell by the consternation of your demeanor that you may disagree or have concern. I think the point that I'm trying to make, all of these gentlemen here, we know, I have seen all of you, and again, I thank you for your service. It has been, as Jan has mentioned, 9 years. It's been longer than that. I remember going to the Sudanese embassy with Tom Lantos and being arrested. I was thinking I'm overdue for another time.
I was with you.
And you were, and we haven't aged a bit. I say that to the friends in the room because we will never get anywhere unless we can get to the table. And for the friend from Sudan who I have had come to explain their circumstances understand our pain and what is being said that can be documented. So let me ask these questions, and again, I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot, meaning the guest from Sudan, but the point is that we're repeating this, it's getting worse, and the only real answer is a commitment from the actors to stop or to completely disprove the testimony of the witnesses. And I imagine that all of you'd want to be disproved. You would want to be where this is not a factual set of circumstances. So I'm just going to pursue the line of questioning that I know that all of you have done, and that is, if I was to go to Darfur right now, could I tell whether anything had changed from when Tom and Jim and Sheila and an array of others, Jan, went to that embassy with a great depth of passion, hoping and thinking that we were raising the ire of the world? That's my first question. My second question is, I think you mentioned at the end of Jan's comment of the conditions in South Sudan. And is there, how do those two things mesh together? It's very, very important. And is there any relief for the relief agencies? Are they getting any respect or any room to do their work in these devastating areas? And I know that this hearing is going on, so I will yield just for those questions and hope that those who are in this room are listening from the perspective that we're here to do good. We're here to save lives. We're here, I've heard some people say when they've been in some businesses fighting Ebola, we'd like the Ebola fighters to be put out of work. That's something we say in America. We don't want human rights to be put out of work, but we want to be able to say that we have brought relief to people. So let me start. Who's eager to start?
All equally eager. Thank you so much, Congresswoman.
And John, it's good to see you again.
To you too. Thanks for sticking with this, all these issues. I would say, I think we will pick pieces of your questions.
That'll be fine. I don't want to keep members here longer.
And for me, I'll take the South Sudan one real quick. And that is...
and you know, we were there welcoming
course.
folk back to a place that we thought we had created in tribute to Don Payne. We thought we had done what we were supposed to do.
And I think that we're at a real pivotal moment right now where the African-led peace process is set a deadline, basically its own deadline tomorrow, for the two parties to come to an agreement. The United Nations Security Council, fairly dramatically, 15-0. I'm somewhat surprised that China and Russia went along with it. Agreed yesterday unanimously to allow or to begin to put sanctions together. They haven't imposed sanctions, but it's enabled sanctions for parties in South Sudan that are undermining peace. So you have a moment here that's very fraught, and Congress again becomes terribly important, because if the moment passes and there is no peace deal, or it's some very, very fractured and an incomplete deal that just sort of allows everybody to pat themselves on the back and go home, but the conflict continues on the ground, then there'll be a choice that the administration and other governments around the world will have to make. Are they going to press and push for real consequences for committing atrocities that are being committed on the ground, for undermining peace? And I think that Congress can help stiffen the backbone of the administration to take those kinds of actions if necessary. So I think it's the same kind of thing, where Congress can be the battering ram, the support structure for the administration to increase its leverage in support of peace, both in Sudan and in South Sudan.
Thank you. What else?
I'll just touch, I guess, on the
Thank you so very much, John.
on the humanitarian assistance
Thank you, John.
issue.
Yeah.
And, just to say that there are big parts of Darfur, particularly Jebel Mara and East Jebel Mara, the sort of mountainous areas in the center of the region, where there is absolutely no humanitarian access, and there hasn't been humanitarian access for several years. And these are areas where humanitarian needs are arguably the most urgent, particularly healthcare. And so this should definitely be something that U.S. policy focuses on much more strongly. U.S. government should be demanding access to these areas for UN agencies and for international NGOs, and then they should also be undertaking more creative approaches to supporting local groups who may have some more success in actually being able to access these areas and deliver urgently needed services.
And if I might cross dialogue to the chairman, that seems like, I know that we'll join you on the work that you're doing, but I'd like to look at some sections that answer some of these concerns, and so look forward to working with you on that. But Tom, good to see you again.
Great to see you. Let me just say that, add on to what you've just heard, that in addition to blocking humanitarian access, as I mentioned in my testimony, and it's in my written testimony, medicine and food are being used as weapons of war. We know that the Sudanese Air Force are deliberately targeting fields and field crops, destroying food. We know that hospitals have been bombed. Doctors Without Borders had a facility bombed, and they had to leave after their facilities have been bombed. So it's not only denying access to humanitarian aid, it is actually attacking the very elements that allow life. Let me also say, again, reiterating what you've heard, is that the key here is accountability. And we need to insist that those who are committing these heinous crimes, and the Bashir regime are behind these crimes, and those that aid and abet those crimes, whether they be institutions, private institutions like banks, as John was mentioning, or whether they be nations who collaborate and hide and welcome. I mentioned in my testimony, Bashir went to 9 different countries last year without comment, including from the United States. So holding those who commit these crimes, holding those that aid and abet these crimes is extremely important. And the legislation that this commission championed last year under the leadership of Congressman McGovern, I think is extremely important because it's comprehensive. It has all of these elements combined in it. And as I mentioned, we believe it very important for that legislation, an updated version recognizing what's happened in those 2 years, be introduced, and we would work as hard as possible to advance it.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back to you, and excuse me for being excused,
No,
but thank you so very much for this work of the commission, and I join.
We're happy you're here. And let me just say, in kind of closing, just for the record, I'm going to formally submit to the record written testimony from Professor Eric Reeves of Smith College, I mentioned at the beginning, who could not be with us here today, but I want to especially thank Eric for the crucial role he has played over the many years in bringing the world's attention to the unjust and tragic reality in Sudan. And I should tell people here that we will at some point be doing a hearing on South Sudan, so that will come. And I want to thank all the witnesses. You have given us a lot of good information, but also good suggestions, and we're going to follow up with the administration on making sure that they have the resources to do the enforcement of the sanctions, because you're right, we could pass all the bills in the world, that impose sanctions, and if you don't have the resources, then you can't enforce it. So, but that will be certainly one of our follow-ups, as well as on this whole issue of the gold, which we will do, and we're working on a kind of updated version of our last year's bill. But look, the message is clear. We're not going to forget this, and we're not going away. And and if the government of Sudan doesn't want additional sanctions, then they ought to get with the program here and begin to respect the human rights of their own people. I mean, it is unconscionable that we are still here. And it's even more unconscionable because we have known what has been going on. We called it genocide 10 years ago. We have known this. This is not a surprise. This is not something where there's a gray area. There's more than enough documentation. Technology has enabled us to understand even better the extent of the killing. So we need to do our jobs here, and I look forward to working with you all. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for being part of this hearing. Hearing is adjourned.